"You don't belong here," Nicole Harris snapped, voice sharp as a whip slicing through the hushed first-class cabin, and every head turned as Marcus Carter paused at the aisle. Dark jeans, black tee, calm presence, blending seamlessly with the understated luxury around him. The sunlight filtered through the small, oval windows, reflecting off polished trays and gleaming seat handles, yet the atmosphere thickened with tension, unspoken judgments hanging like invisible clouds over every passenger. Marcus held his boarding pass steady in one hand, sliding it toward Nicole without a flicker of agitation, his eyes meeting hers with a quiet intensity that seemed to say he had already seen this before, that her snap, her words, were just echoes of every assumption he'd encountered in his life. Around them, murmurs began to rise. Some passengers shifted, glances exchanged, subtle whispers questioning the scene unfolding. The young trainee, Mia Lang, nervously fumbled with her tablet, starting to record, her pulse quickening as she sensed the injustice, the subtle orchestration of bias in full display, while the older couple nearby froze mid-conversation, champagne flutes in hand, unsure whether to intervene or remain spectators. Marcus's mind, calm and methodical, traced back to the memory of his first airline job 20 years ago, the same dismissals, the same casual disbelief at his capabilities, the same assumptions based on appearances alone, and he allowed himself a measured, silent exhale, the kind that carried decades of restraint and strategic patience. Nicole stepped closer, a hand half raised, motioning for him to vacate the seat, eyes darting to the cabin manager who approached with clipped urgency. But Marcus remained still, seated like an anchor, presence commanding without sound, letting the weight of the moment press against the false authority around him. Each whisper, each skeptical glance from the crew only emphasized the absurdity of the situation, the misjudgment that had brought them to this crescendo. Passengers in adjacent rows subtly leaned forward, phones lifted discreetly, the anticipation electric, a quiet collective breath held in suspense as the drama quietly intensified. Marcus adjusted his posture, a minor shift, imperceptible but loaded, signaling readiness, awareness, authority contained in every line of his frame. He caught the gaze of the young trainee again, nodded imperceptibly, the silent communication of someone who knew exactly when to act, who understood the board alert awaiting a single cue from his calm command. The cabin's chatter dimmed to near silence, tension coiling tight as the moment stretched, seconds elongating with potential, a high wire of anticipation. Nicole's lips tightened, a flicker of doubt crossing her features as she registered the calmness that was anything but ordinary, the quiet certainty that this was no ordinary passenger. Marcus lifted his gaze slowly to meet the eyes of the captain, Daniel Pierce, who stood near the cockpit with the professional detachment of authority, unaware that the storm was about to shift entirely, that the man before him was not merely a passenger, but a decisive force, ready to turn assumptions into revelation, bias into exposure. As the first glimmers of recognition began to ripple across the cabin, passengers shifting, whispers growing, and a sense of inevitability building toward a moment that promised to leave everyone questioning everything they thought they knew. Nicole Harris folded her arms and stepped closer, the movement subtle but loaded with intent, while Marcus Carter kept his composure, eyes unwavering, observing each subtle gesture in the cabin, every twitch of discomfort, every fleeting glance of uncertainty. Passengers shifted in their seats, some leaning forward, others discreetly raising their phones, sensing the mounting tension and anticipating the next moment of revelation. Marcus slid the boarding pass across the tray again, deliberately slow, allowing the crispness of the paper to echo in the otherwise quiet cabin, a small sound magnified by the silence surrounding the confrontation. He remembered vividly the countless times in his early career when assumptions had been made about him, when he had been underestimated because of his appearance, because of how he dressed, and how he carried himself. The memory was sharp, precise, fueling a calm that was anything but ordinary. Nicole smirked slightly, thinking she held the upper hand, glancing at her colleagues, expecting validation, expecting compliance. Yet Marcus remained seated, still and anchored, radiating a presence that demanded recognition without a word. Mia Lang, the trainee, hesitated, hand hovering over the record button, heart pounding, aware that she was witnessing a masterclass in composure and strategy, the kind that transformed mere presence into authority. Around them, the murmurs of passengers became faint undercurrents, some discreetly whispering to one another, questioning the situation, unsure of who was in the right, yet captivated by the unfolding dynamic. Marcus's gaze swept the cabin, noting small details, the crease of a doubt in a passenger's brow, the slight stiffening of a flight attendant's posture, the subtle hesitation of the cabin crew as they processed the quiet power he exuded. He inhaled slowly, a controlled rhythm, each breath measured, each pause intentional, letting the weight of the moment settle like a tangible force, drawing attention without aggression. The captain, Daniel Pierce, stepped a little closer, authority etched in his stance, unaware that the scene he was attempting to control was about to shift dramatically, that Marcus Carter was not simply a passenger, but a catalyst for a revelation that would alter the perception of every individual in the cabin. Marcus touched his phone lightly, signaling to his executive assistant, Rachel, activating the prearranged protocol that would bring clarity and verification without a hint of chaos. The calm before the storm in perfect alignment with decades of preparation and strategic restraint. The cabin's atmosphere grew taut with anticipation, every whisper, every subtle movement magnified, every glance a prelude to the moment when silent power would transform into undeniable recognition, and passengers held their collective breath, caught in the gravitational pull of a story about to turn, a lesson in patience, dignity, and the quiet assertion of authority that needed no demonstration beyond presence and poised action. The cabin remained silent, a tense stillness stretching like a taut wire from the cockpit to the last row, as Marcus Carter's calm presence began to ripple through every passenger and crew member. Nicole Harris glanced at her colleagues, eyes flickering with doubt, noticing for the first time that the man before them was not reacting with anger or panic, but with an unshakable quiet authority. Each subtle movement Marcus made was deliberate, measured, a demonstration of control without a word. The passengers leaned slightly in their seats, curiosity mixing with anticipation, their eyes tracing the interactions, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding. Marcus's gaze swept across the cabin, pausing on those recording discreetly, acknowledging them with a brief nod, a silent signal that their documentation would bear witness to what was about to occur. The murmurs of disbelief began to rise, passengers whispering to one another, questioning why a man so plainly dressed could command such unspoken power. The crew hesitated, glances exchanged, realizing their assumptions had placed them in the uncomfortable position of being observed rather than in control, the weight of their misjudgment pressing on every gesture. Marcus's fingers tapped lightly against the phone resting in his lap, a controlled rhythm, and Rachel's calm voice came through his earpiece, confirming the board alert had been activated, the verification protocol engaged, and the entire process poised to unfold with precision. As the seconds stretched, the cabin seemed suspended in an invisible current of expectation, the collective attention of passengers and crew alike focused on the man who sat silently, yet commanded the entire space. Marcus recalled the early moments of his career, the subtle exclusions, the assumptions made about his abilities based solely on appearance, the quiet moments of dismissal that had forged his patience, resilience, and understanding of power. Now, all of those experiences converged in this singular moment of poised authority, a silent demonstration of capability and presence. Nicole's hand hovered, uncertain, and the captain shifted slightly, sensing the shift in the cabin's energy, the realization that this situation was no longer under their usual control. Marcus adjusted his posture minutely, every motion a statement of awareness and intention, each small action amplifying the gravity of the moment. The passengers watched, some holding their phones, some leaning forward, all captivated by the unfolding tension, aware that they were witnessing a subtle confrontation that carried far more weight than appearances suggested. The anticipation built as the cabin collectively held its breath, every movement, every glance, every breath charged with the promise of revelation, and Marcus Carter remained the calm center, ready to transform the quiet authority into undeniable recognition at the precise moment it would have the greatest impact. Nicole Harris took a hesitant step back, her smirk fading as the subtle shift in the cabin became undeniable. The collective attention of the passengers and crew now focused entirely on Marcus Carter, who remained seated, poised, eyes calm yet piercing, scanning the cabin with an unspoken command that drew every glance toward him. The passengers exchanged quiet murmurs, a ripple of awareness passing from row to row, whispers like currents of recognition spreading through the cabin, each person sensing that the assumptions they had carried for so long were being challenged by this composed presence. Marcus adjusted his posture, straightening slightly, his movements deliberate, conveying authority without a single raised voice, each subtle shift amplifying the tension and holding the cabin in a suspended state of anticipation. Mia Lang, the young trainee, kept her device recording, her hands trembling slightly, understanding that she was witnessing a masterclass in restraint and strategic presence, the kind of control that transforms perception without confrontation. Around them, Nicole glanced toward the captain, Daniel Pierce, whose expression flickered with uncertainty as he recognized the quiet power emanating from Marcus, a force that demanded acknowledgment through presence alone. The passengers leaned forward, some raising their phones discreetly, capturing every detail, their attention unwavering as they observed the intricate interplay of authority and composure. Marcus's mind traced the familiar patterns of bias he had faced in countless scenarios throughout his career, the subtle dismissals, the assumptions of incompetence, and the misjudgments based solely on appearance, and he allowed those memories to settle into a calm resolve, a silent reservoir of strength ready to convert patience into action. The murmurs grew, hushed conversations punctuated by quiet gasps and nods of recognition as the reality of the moment settled in, the tension palpable yet contained, the cabin vibrating with the anticipation of revelation. Marcus lifted his gaze to meet Nicole's, a slow, deliberate motion, eyes locking, communicating with the clarity of authority that required no words, just presence and intention. Every subtle gesture of the crew reflected their growing awareness that their assumptions had misjudged the situation, that control had shifted without a single declaration, and the passengers became silent witnesses to this quiet recalibration of power. Marcus's fingers brushed lightly against the phone in his lap, signaling to his executive assistant, Rachel, confirming that the protocol was ready, the verification process poised to validate his identity and authority with precision. The atmosphere held, taut and expectant, every movement, every glance weighted with significance, the passengers' collective gaze unwavering as Marcus Carter, seated yet commanding, prepared to transform the subtle currents of doubt and bias into a moment of undeniable clarity, a revelation that would leave the cabin irrevocably altered in perception and understanding. The hum of the engines became a faint backdrop as Marcus Carter's focus sharpened, every detail of the cabin, every subtle shift of the crew and passengers, entering his awareness with precision. Nicole Harris's initial confidence wavered, her hand hesitating mid-motion, as she realized that Marcus's calm was not ignorance or weakness, but deliberate control, the kind that comes from years of navigating spaces where assumptions were routinely made against him. The passengers began to notice the shift, eyes darting between Marcus and the crew, whispers rising softly, a quiet ripple of acknowledgment spreading through the cabin. Marcus allowed the silence to stretch, letting it speak for him, every passenger feeling the weight of his presence, the unspoken message that assumptions could be challenged without confrontation, that authority could be asserted without raising a voice. He reflected on the countless times he had been underestimated, the lessons learned in patience and measured response, the understanding that power was not in volume, but in the ability to hold a space, to command respect through presence alone. Mia Lang's device recorded each movement, each glance, the subtle tension building like a slow crescendo, capturing a moment that would become a testament to composure and strategic awareness. The cabin, once brimming with quiet tension and judgment, now felt suspended in anticipation, passengers leaning forward, subtle nods exchanged, the realization dawning that they were witnessing something extraordinary, a demonstration of quiet, disciplined power. Marcus's gaze swept over the crew again, noting the flicker of doubt, the brief hesitation, and the subtle recalibration in their demeanor, the shift in energy palpable as the cabin collectively recognized that the dynamic had changed irrevocably. He touched his phone again, a light press, and Rachel's voice responded calmly, confirming that the verification protocol was active, the board alert in motion, ready to provide clarity and authority to the unfolding situation. Every detail mattered, the tilt of a head, the crossing of arms, the subtle movements of feet. As Marcus remained seated, calm, radiating control, each measured breath reinforcing the inevitability of the coming revelation. The passengers' attention was rapt, some holding their phones, some leaning forward, every gaze fixed on Marcus, each aware that the moment was approaching when the quiet authority he projected would transform into undeniable recognition. The subtle power he emanated began to influence the atmosphere itself, a shift so imperceptible yet undeniable that even those who had doubted him could feel the gravity of the moment pressing upon them. As the seconds stretched, the cabin collectively held its breath, the anticipation mounting, and Marcus Carter, seated but commanding, prepared to turn silent composure into the catalyst for revelation, a quiet assertion of authority that would leave every witness in the cabin reevaluating every assumption they had held. The cabin held its breath as Marcus Carter lifted his hand slightly, a subtle gesture that carried the weight of his authority, drawing the eyes of every passenger and crew member toward him. Nicole Harris's confidence had dissolved into a flicker of uncertainty, her fingers tightening around the edge of the tray table as she realized that the quiet man seated before her was far from ordinary, his presence commanding attention without a single raised voice. Passengers shifted in their seats, leaning forward slightly, some instinctively reaching for their phones, others simply watching, captivated by the tension and the meticulous composure of the figure at the center of the cabin. Marcus's eyes scanned the cabin once more, noting every flicker of doubt, every momentary hesitation, every subtle recalibration of posture from the crew, and allowed a slight nod to Mia Lang, the trainee, signaling that her discreet recording was timely and essential, that the quiet observation of history in the making was recognized. The captain, Daniel Pierce, stepped closer, clipboard in hand, attempting to maintain the formal authority of his position. Yet Marcus's calm radiance made every motion seem inconsequential, the balance of power quietly shifting in a room full of witnesses. The air in the cabin grew taut, anticipation humming just beneath the surface as each passenger processed the unfolding scene, a silent drama that transcended simple protocol, a demonstration of composure and mastery over perception. Marcus allowed his gaze to rest momentarily on Nicole, slow and deliberate, conveying understanding without words, a recognition of the situation's gravity and the inevitability of the approaching revelation. The murmurs of passengers grew subtly, a ripple of understanding and empathy, the realization that they were witnessing more than an ordinary dispute, that the quiet command he emanated was a product of years of navigating spaces where assumptions were routinely made against him. Each breath Marcus drew was measured, each blink intentional, reinforcing a presence that was impossible to ignore, the cabin absorbing the tension as if it had become a tangible force, pressing gently against everyone present. Around them, passengers whispered to one another, some exchanging knowing glances, others shaking their heads in disbelief, the subtle recognition of unfair assumptions and the quiet power to correct them building collectively. Marcus's hand rested lightly on his phone, the connection to Rachel alive, the verification protocol in motion, the wheels of clarity turning silently and efficiently, ready to convert the patience he had maintained for decades into the moment of undeniable recognition. The cabin seemed suspended. In that invisible current of expectation, every movement, every glance magnified, every silent gesture amplified, as Marcus Carter, seated yet radiating authority, prepared to shift the dynamic completely, demonstrating that quiet composure and measured strategy could command the attention and respect of an entire space, leaving every observer poised on the edge of realization. Nicole Harris's eyes narrowed as she realized that her previous gestures had no impact, the confidence that had once defined her authority now wavering under Marcus Carter's unyielding calm. He remained seated, each movement deliberate, a subtle adjustment of posture that radiated power without a single word, the cabin holding its collective breath. The passengers' attention sharpened, whispers fading into anticipation as they watched the quiet mastery of composure, sensing that the balance of authority had shifted in a space where assumptions had long gone unchallenged. Marcus's gaze scanned the crew again, noting the slight stiffening in Nicole's shoulders, the hesitation of Brian Foster beside her, and the fleeting uncertainty in the captain's stance. Each subtle movement of theirs reinforced the contrast between impulsive judgment and patient command, and Marcus allowed the pause to stretch, letting the silent authority of presence resonate fully. Mia Lang, still recording discreetly, captured every micro-expression, every flicker of doubt, and the murmurs of nearby passengers added an undercurrent of awareness, a quiet acknowledgment of the injustice they had almost ignored. Marcus's fingers hovered lightly over his phone, tapping once, a controlled rhythm, signaling to Rachel that the protocol was ready, that verification and confirmation would soon materialize, validating what had always been true. The tension thickened as passengers shifted slightly in their seats, leaning forward, adjusting their positions to witness the unfolding revelation, eyes reflecting the slow realization of who he truly was. Marcus recalled the subtle dismissals of his early career, the moments when assumptions based on appearance or casual judgments could have dictated outcomes, and he drew from those memories a calm energy, a reservoir of poise that allowed him to sit unmoved while the room's perception slowly realigned. The subtle orchestration of control, the strategic use of stillness, and the quiet projection of authority created a magnetic field that pulled the attention of everyone in the cabin, creating an atmosphere dense with anticipation. Nicole's hand twitched, caught between the instinct to assert control and the dawning recognition that she had misjudged the situation entirely. Marcus's eyes lingered on her briefly, a measured acknowledgment of the shifting dynamic, before sweeping across the passengers, the young trainee, and the captain, all absorbing the weight of the moment. The cabin remained suspended in that delicate tension, a collective breath held, the air almost visible with expectation as Marcus Carter, seated and composed, prepared for the precise moment when silent authority would become undeniable recognition, the shift in perception complete, and the quiet patience of decades would converge into the powerful validation of his presence, leaving the crew and passengers alike re-examining every assumption and judgment they had carried until that very second. The quiet tension in the cabin thickened as Marcus Carter remained seated, his posture perfect, exuding calm authority that seemed to expand outward, touching every passenger and crew member without a word. Nicole Harris's initial arrogance had faded, replaced with hesitation, her hand lingering uncertainly near the service card as she realized that the presence before her was not ordinary, that the quiet composure carried an undeniable weight. Passengers began to shift, subtly leaning forward, whispering among themselves, the hum of anticipation growing as they observed every nuance, every slight movement, the unfolding drama more compelling than any announcement or command. Marcus allowed his eyes to travel across the cabin, catching the gaze of the captain, Daniel Pierce, who shifted slightly, realizing that the balance of authority had moved subtly, imperceptibly, yet unmistakably, toward the man seated calmly, entirely in control. Mia Lang, recording discreetly, held her device steady, capturing each flicker of doubt, every nuanced glance, understanding that the quiet presence of Marcus Carter was commanding attention in a way that would leave a lasting impression. The cabin seemed to pulse with anticipation, every passenger aware of the subtle orchestration of authority, the careful projection of power through patience and observation, the controlled use of silence as a tool far more potent than confrontation. Marcus reflected briefly on the early moments of his career, the countless times assumptions had been made against him, the small dismissals that accumulated over the years, shaping his ability to command without raising his voice, to assert dominance through presence alone. The murmurs of passengers increased, subtle yet insistent, a collective awareness building, the realization that they were witnesses to a quiet reclamation of authority, that the scene before them carried more significance than simple protocol. Marcus's fingers moved lightly across his phone, a deliberate rhythm, signaling to Rachel that the verification protocol was active, that the board alert had been triggered, and that clarity and recognition would soon arrive with precision. Every movement in the cabin, every glance, every shift in posture, magnified the anticipation, passengers sensing that the moment of revelation was imminent, a quiet authority poised to transform perception and understanding. Marcus's gaze lingered on Nicole briefly, slow and deliberate, conveying the full weight of experience and the inevitability of the moment, then swept across the rows of passengers, the young trainee, and the captain, all absorbing the unspoken power radiating from him. The air seemed to vibrate with expectancy, each person aware that the next moment would crystallize the truth, and Marcus Carter, seated, composed, and utterly controlled, prepared to convert decades of patience and measured strategy into the defining moment that would shift every assumption, leaving the cabin poised on the edge of realization and ready to witness the undeniable assertion of his authority. Marcus Carter lifted his hand slightly, tapping lightly on his phone as Rachel confirmed that the board alert had been received and verification protocol was active, a controlled signal that the quiet authority he exuded was about to be validated. Nicole Harris froze, her confidence eroding as the realization dawned that the man before her was not only calm, but fully in command of the situation, and the subtle shift in power was palpable to everyone present. Passengers shifted in their seats, some leaning forward, others discreetly raising their phones to record, eyes fixed on the unfolding scene as the tension reached its apex without a single raised voice. Marcus allowed a slow exhale, measured and deliberate, as the memory of years spent navigating spaces where assumptions had been made against him resurfaced, shaping the precision of his response, the quiet patience that now dictated the room. The cabin seemed to hold its collective breath, a suspended moment where every gaze, every movement, and every subtle gesture was amplified by anticipation, the atmosphere dense with awareness. Captain Daniel Pierce adjusted his stance slightly, glancing at the crew who were now visibly unsettled, the habitual authority he carried now tempered by the undeniable presence of Marcus. Mia Lang, recording discreetly, felt the weight of history in the making, each flicker of doubt on Nicole's face and each subtle shift in posture captured as evidence of the controlled recalibration of the cabin's dynamic. Marcus's gaze swept the rows of passengers, acknowledging the subtle attention, the quiet recognition that they were witnessing a demonstration of power through presence, a lesson in patience and authority executed with precision. Nicole glanced down at the torn boarding pass, realization slowly etching across her features, and the room seemed to vibrate with the understanding that assumptions had misjudged the situation entirely. Marcus's posture remained poised, each micro-movement intentional, communicating control, awareness, and the inevitability of the forthcoming revelation. The whispers of passengers rose softly, a low murmur that reflected collective acknowledgment, anticipation growing as the invisible threads of authority shifted subtly, yet decisively toward Marcus. He allowed the silence to stretch, each second deliberate, reinforcing the weight of presence over speech, demonstrating that control need not be loud to be absolute. The cabin held on the cusp of transformation, every observer sensing that the next moments would crystallize truth and recognition, that the quiet assertion of authority Marcus maintained would convert into undeniable acknowledgment, a realignment of perception that left the crew, passengers, and even the captain reconsidering the assumptions they had carried until this exact instant. As Marcus sat poised, fingers lightly resting on his phone, the calm before the revelation became a palpable force, an invisible current of expectation that charged the air and drew every eye toward the man whose patience, experience, and composed strategy were about to culminate in a moment of unassailable clarity. Marcus Carter slowly rose from his seat, the motion deliberate, precise, drawing every eye in the cabin toward him as if gravity itself had shifted. The passengers leaned forward, subtle movements charged with anticipation, and the murmurs of curiosity swelled into a quiet chorus of recognition. Nicole Harris's gaze flickered with unease, her previous confidence eroding as the presence before her revealed itself fully, a composed authority that demanded attention without a single raised voice. Marcus's hand hovered briefly over his phone, a signal to Rachel confirming that the board alert and verification protocol had fully activated, every detail accounted for, and ready to substantiate the authority he carried silently. The crew exchanged hesitant glances, the captain adjusting his stance slightly, sensing the shift in the room's energy, aware that assumptions had failed, and the quiet command emanating from Marcus could not be ignored. Marcus allowed his eyes to sweep the cabin. Again, noting subtle reactions, passengers leaning in, whispers muted but persistent, the trainee Mia Lang recording steadily, capturing each nuanced expression of doubt, each fleeting hesitation, the slow realization of the power balance shifting in real time. The memory of past dismissals, the early career moments where appearance dictated perception, surfaced within him, yet he remained calm, every motion and gesture controlled, projecting a quiet authority that spoke louder than words. Nicole's lips pressed together, a barely perceptible tremor, as she comprehended that she had misjudged the situation completely, the subtle authority radiating from Marcus unassailable and clear. The cabin seemed to pause, a moment stretched taut with expectation, every observer aware that the next seconds would crystallize the truth, a silent, yet overwhelming demonstration of recognition. Marcus's gaze moved slowly from the crew to the passengers, registering the collective shift in attention, the silent acknowledgement that the room had collectively witnessed the realignment of perception, the subtle power of presence over assumption. Each passenger felt the tension transform into understanding, the anticipation giving way to a quiet respect that spread through the cabin like a current, subtle yet undeniable. Marcus's posture remained unshaken, deliberate, each micro-movement reinforcing the inevitability of the moment, a demonstration that control and authority did not require confrontation, only presence, patience, and precise timing. The hum of the engines and the subtle creak of the seats became background to the gravity of realization as the cabin collectively absorbed the moment, every glance and gesture magnified by the anticipation of what would unfold next, and Marcus Carter, seated yet commanding, prepared to turn the quiet observation, the disciplined restraint, and the careful orchestration of authority into the undeniable revelation that would leave every passenger and crew member with a renewed understanding of respect, recognition, and the quiet assertion of true power. Marcus Carter finally spoke, his voice low but carrying a precision that made every ear in the cabin attune to his words. "I am Marcus Carter, Chief Executive Officer and 25% owner of this airline." The words landed like a soft clap that expanded through the rows, passengers leaning forward instinctively, some holding their phones higher, capturing the moment while others exchanged subtle glances of surprise and recognition. Nicole Harris's face paled, the smirk that had anchored her previous confidence evaporating, replaced by the sudden awareness that she had misjudged the situation entirely, that the man she had assumed to be ordinary commanded authority in a way that no uniform or procedural gesture could match. Marcus's eyes scanned the cabin deliberately, taking in each reaction, noting the astonishment on passengers' faces, the subtle shift in posture of the crew, the hesitation in the captain's stance, and he allowed the room to absorb the truth without additional words, the silence itself acting as a conduit for acknowledgment. Mia Lang, the young trainee, kept her recording steady, her hands shaking slightly as she realized she was witnessing a moment that would be referenced again and again, a demonstration of composure and authority that required no theatrics. The cabin atmosphere transformed, the tension giving way to a sense of respect and awareness, whispers rippling softly as passengers processed what had just occurred, understanding that assumptions and appearances had been challenged in real time. Marcus allowed a brief pause, letting the subtle acknowledgement from the room settle in, his calm demeanor reinforcing the reality that authority could be asserted through presence, measured actions, and strategic patience rather than loud confrontation, and withdrew a sleek matte black business card, sliding it across the tray with deliberate precision toward Nicole Harris, who now stared at it, as if the world had paused. Every passenger in the cabin leaned forward slightly, their attention riveted, whispers replaced by a charged silence as the full significance of the card sank in. Marcus's voice, calm and measured, carried across the cabin without raising volume. This card represents my position as Chief Executive Officer and 25% owner of this airline. The room seemed to exhale collectively, the crew frozen mid-step, passengers wide-eyed, phones raised instinctively, capturing the moment of revelation that transformed the entire dynamic of the cabin. Nicole's eyes widened, and she swallowed hard, realizing for the first time that the assumptions she had relied upon to justify her actions were completely unfounded, and the quiet composure of Marcus Carter commanded acknowledgment without any additional argument. Mia Lang, the trainee, felt a surge of admiration as she held the recording steady, her hands trembling slightly with the understanding that she was documenting a historic moment, the demonstration of authority achieved through poise, preparation, and silent command. The passengers' whispers turned into subtle nods and shared glances, a wave of recognition spreading quietly as the atmosphere shifted from tension to respect, the cabin collectively acknowledging that the quietest presence had carried the greatest authority. Marcus allowed a brief pause, letting the weight of recognition settle across the room, his eyes sweeping each row of passengers and crew, noting every subtle shift in posture, every micro-expression that reflected the dawning comprehension of his true role. Captain Daniel Pierce, standing near the cockpit, adjusted his stance, a quiet acknowledgement that the usual control he exerted had been overtaken not by confrontation, but by composed and undeniable authority. The murmurs of passengers grew, soft but insistent, carrying an understanding that assumptions had been challenged, that a lesson in quiet dignity and strategic presence was unfolding before their eyes. Marcus's demeanor remained poised, deliberate, each micro-movement reinforcing the clarity of his position, communicating to Nicole and the crew that the moment had passed beyond debate, the validation of authority complete. The cabin felt suspended in a collective recognition, a subtle yet pervasive understanding that the dynamics had shifted irrevocably, and Marcus Carter's quiet control and measured patience had transformed the space, turning skepticism into respect, hesitation into acknowledgment, and doubt into an unmistakable awareness of his power. The subtle orchestration of calm, the deliberate use of silence, and the precise execution of authority had culminated in a moment where the cabin was fully aligned with recognition, leaving every observer, from crew to passengers, acutely aware that the balance of perception and respect had been restored, and the quiet mastery of Marcus Carter had achieved its intended effect. The cabin exhaled collectively, the subtle tension transforming into an atmosphere charged with recognition as Marcus Carter allowed himself a measured smile, a quiet acknowledgement that the moment had reached its apex. Nicole Harris stepped back, finally understanding that the assumptions she had clung to were entirely unfounded, the confidence she had wielded evaporating under the undeniable presence of Marcus's calm authority. Passengers leaned forward, some whispering softly to one another, their phones capturing the expressions, the gestures, the silent orchestration of command that had unfolded without a single raised voice. The crew, frozen moments before, now shifted subtly, adjusting their posture, the weight of realization settling upon them as they absorbed the clarity and finality of the moment. Marcus's gaze swept across the cabin, noting each passenger's reaction, every subtle nod of understanding, every flicker of acknowledgement, and he allowed the silence to resonate, the absence of conflict itself magnifying the power that had been asserted quietly, methodically, and irrevocably. Mia Lang kept recording, her hands steady now, capturing a demonstration of authority so precise and poised that it seemed to redefine the very notion of influence within the confined space of the first-class cabin. Marcus reflected internally on the decades of experience, the countless times assumptions had been made against him, and how each encounter had refined his ability to assert presence and command without confrontation. The murmurs of passengers became a quiet hum of recognition, the subtle energy shifting from disbelief to understanding, a shared acknowledgement that the dynamics of the cabin had irrevocably changed. Marcus adjusted slightly in his seat, a small, deliberate movement, signaling control and awareness, reinforcing the authority that had been established through silent observation and strategic patience. The captain, Daniel Pierce, exchanged a glance with the senior crew members, all now fully aware that the course of the cabin's interaction had been completely redefined by the composed figure seated before them, a recognition that true authority often came not from procedural power but from the confident, measured assertion of self. Nicole's colleagues followed her lead, each absorbing the lesson in humility, awareness, and the quiet enforcement of respect that Marcus had orchestrated seamlessly. Passengers exchanged glances, subtle smiles forming as they processed what they had witnessed, the cabin alive with a sense of validation, understanding, and awe at the quiet mastery displayed. Marcus allowed a final slow exhale, eyes meeting several passengers' gazes briefly, acknowledging their recognition, the satisfaction of a controlled and deliberate resolution settling over him. The cabin, once a stage of tension and uncertainty, now held a unified sense of clarity, every observer absorbing the lesson in quiet authority, patience, and the deliberate application of power, leaving a lasting impression of dignity, strategic presence, and the undeniable impact of composed action that would resonate long after the flight had concluded.